Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the store's event coordinator. Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. So thank you all for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to welcome Robert Lopez for the release of his novel In Stories, A Better Class of People, in conversation with Tracy O'Neill. Now to some housekeeping before I introduce our guests. We've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, click on the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections. So please do bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. We have a great lineup of events planned for you this spring, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is next Monday, April 18th, we'll be collaborating with our friends at Third Place Books, Harvard Bookstore, and Brazos Bookstore to welcome Karen Balin and Cristina Rivera Garza in celebration of their new books, both newly released from Dorothy, a publishing project. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now, a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Robert Lopez is the author of 3 novels, Part of the World, Kambi Bolongo Mean River, named one of 25 important books of the decade by HTML Giant, and All Back Full, and 2 story collections, Asunder and Good People. His novel In Stories, A Better Class of People, is out now from Jank Books. Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere, his first nonfiction book, will be published by $2 Radio in March 2023. His fiction, nonfiction, and poetry has appeared in dozens of publications, including Bomb, The Threepenny Review, Vice Magazine, New England Review, The Sun, and the Norton Anthology of Sudden Fiction Latino. He teaches at Stony Brook University and has previously taught at Columbia University, the New School, Pratt Institute, and Syracuse University. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. And Tracy O'Neill is the author of The Hopeful, one of electric literature's best novels of 2015, and Quotients, a New York Times new and noteworthy book, Tour Editor's Choice, and Literary Hub Favorite Book of 2020. In 2015, she was named a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, longlisted for the Flaherty Dunnan Prize, and was a Narrative Under 30 finalist. In 2012, she was awarded the Center for Fiction's Emerging Writers Fellowship. Her short fiction was distinguished in the Best American Short Stories 2016 and earned a Pushcart Prize nomination in 2017. Her writing has appeared in Granta, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Lit Hub, Bomb, Volume 1, Brooklyn, The Believer, The Literarian, The Austin Chronicle, New World Writing, The Baffler, Narrative, 4 Columns, Scoundrel Time, Guernica Book Forum, Electric Literature, Grantland, Vice, The Guardian, VQR, and The San Francisco Chronicle, as well as Catapult. She holds an MFA from the City College of New York and an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD from Columbia University. While editor-in-chief of the literary journal Epiphany, she established the Breakout 8 Writers Prize with the Authors Guild, and she now teaches at Vassar College. So now without any further ado, I will hand it off to you two. Robert, Tracy, thank you both so much for being here tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, Noah, I appreciate it. I'm gonna read a couple of short bits from the book, and then we will move on. I want to thank everybody for being here. So how the book works, there's a long story and then there's a short story, a flash fiction set on the subway, and that takes you to the next story. So I'm going to read a couple of the subway jobs. This one is called The Thedahlberg Repercussions. The woman on the subway looked like my mother, so I sat down next to her and said, "You look like my mother." I said, "Does it seem like that to you, that you are someone who looks like my mother and that I look like someone who could be your son if circumstances were different? That is, if you were old enough to be my mother or I were young enough to be your son." I said, "Don't misunderstand me." I said, "You look like how my mother used to look, not how she looks now. Although my mother still looks good, and I didn't mean to imply otherwise." I said, "My mother is a good-looking woman, and that bodes well for all of us. I'm talking about genes now more than anything else. The truth is, I haven't seen my mother in 20 years because she won't have anything more to do with me. So when I said my mother looks good now, it's only speculation. I remember her own mother, my grandmother that is, and she kept her looks well into her 70s. This is when the woman who looked like my mother said, "Excuse me, sir," and I admonished her for being so formal. I said, "How dare you with someone that could be your son if circumstances were different?" I could tell she was from a better class of people by the way she spoke and what she wore, and thus could never be my mother, but I kept on anyway. This is when the woman who looked like my mother got up from the bench and walked over to the doors. She stood there staring straight into her own reflection and waiting for the next stop. She looked like a flagpole in an open field to me. It looked like she couldn't be toppled, like she was entirely unmovable, and that she would never acknowledge that she was someone who looked like my mother, or that I was someone who could be her son. All right. I'm imagining that the crowd is going wild at this point. This one is another subway deal, and it's called "What Is or Isn't Collapsing." 4 deaf kids are talking shit about me on the other side of the car. I can tell it's me they're talking about because every so often they look my way and start in with the hands and fingers. I'm wearing headphones, so they probably think I'm showing off. There are maybe 10 people with headphones in, so I don't know why they have singled me out. I tried smiling at the girl, but I think she took it the wrong way. Something in her face told me I should fuck off because she doesn't take kindly to older men who smile at her on the subway with only one thing on their mind. I'm not sure why she thinks this about me because it's not the truth. I almost want to tell them about my tinnitus, that I have it in both ears now, and it's awful. I could tell them that I'm losing my hearing too, particularly in my left ear, and I'm too old to learn sign language. I can never go on a subway and talk to anyone after I'm deaf, so these kids don't know how lucky they are. They're all spread out in the car, occupying different benches, and still they can talk to each other and not bother anyone. This is probably the greatest gift, but instead they go around in pity for themselves. I don't talk to anyone on the subway if I can help it, and I almost never take the subway with someone I know. And the girl I smiled at, it had nothing to do with what's spilling out of the top of her blouse. So it's something like a Mexican standoff, except that would have to involve another person. So it's not exactly like that either. Maybe if there was a blind person in the subway car, one with a seeing eye dog and a cane, then we could have a real Mexican standoff. And if everyone had their guns on them, we could all shoot each other in the face. That would be glorious. You do see people shooting other people on the subway, so it's not impossible, but I should stop thinking about it because thinking gets you nowhere. Instead, I could tell them I'm going deaf on account of the tinnitus and blind because of keratoconus, which I've had for 30 years now. I could try telling them this. I could try schooling them, but what then? These kids don't want to hear from the likes of me, and maybe they're right. The song I'm listening to with my headphones has some poor bastard asking to borrow lungs because his are collapsing. He says that Jesus was an only son and love is only concept, but it all goes to hell when strangers come in foreign tongues and dirty up the doorstep. This proves that even Jesus didn't like Europeans and South Americans. You can't blame Jesus because it was the Europeans that killed him and the South Americans stood by and did nothing to stop it. So when I look at these kids, I see the Romans and Incas in league with each other. And you know, it doesn't even occur to them that I might be Jesus on the cross in this scenario. Okay, what's that, 7:40. I'll read the first couple of lines perhaps from another bit, and then Tracy, maybe you and I could say something to each other. All right, so this one is called Royboy. I used to call him Royboy, not for any other reason than I liked the sound of it. Those two monosyllabic words up against each other and rhyming like a boxer's 1-2 punch, a jab and a cross, coming down square on the chin. And there were rumors he liked men. And I never wanted to confuse him because I didn't like men, or at least I didn't like them the way Royboy was rumored to like them. But I also wanted him in my corner because he worked at the back of the house and I needed him to do things for me, get things, fix things, assemble things. So I never minded if Royboy thought I liked him. And he seemed like a good guy and I didn't care about the rumors. And even when people asked what I thought about Royboy, I'd say, I don't think anything. And they'd ask why I called him Royboy, because everyone called him either Roy or Chico. Even his older brother, Jorge, who got him the job and was in charge of the back of the house. And I tell them how I like the sound of it, the 1-2 punch. And I don't think they ever believed me. I think they thought there was more to it, but I didn't care because I liked Esperanza, who worked in the front of the house with me. And she knew the truth, or she would know it if I ever got her alone, which never happened. And I still don't know why, because it was clear she liked me too. But then something spooked her, and you can never tell with women, which is something you hear from the back of the house all the time. Even Royboy, who I liked best out of all of them, because he'd always have a smile on his face whenever you went back there to ask him to fix or assemble something. Not like the rest of them, Jorge and the others, who would curse you in Spanish and call you maricón if you asked them to do anything. And this was especially true when they found out I was half Rican and couldn't speak the language. They would ask me a question in mile-a-minute Spanish, and I'd sing the lyrics to Oye Como Va in response, which was the only Spanish I knew. So you know they hated my guts, but they hated everyone in the front of the house. They'd throw tortillas and ladles at you when you crossed through the kitchen, but you couldn't blame them because it was awful back there. That rotten, stale stench getting into your body and coming out of your pores, the heat bouncing off the walls, and there was nowhere to hide except maybe the walk-in. And you couldn't last long in there no matter how hot it was. And every time you went back there, you had to hold your breath and try not to let those bastards get to you. Like how they'd harass all the women, including Esperanza, who was their favorite because of the tight skirts and sweaters. And they'd drop utensils on the floor, so she'd have to bend over to pick them up, and they'd all hoot and holler. And then everyone would laugh and laugh, including Esperanza, who was a good sport, even with those pendejos, which was one of the reasons I always liked her, until everyone went too far and got carried away. But we aren't permitted to talk about that. So let's say she was always classy. Never went along when I told Jorge and the rest of them that too icy questions. He even mentioned you by name, Jorge. How do you like that? Bueno par gozar, mi amigo. And to this day, I don't know what might have spooked her, except to say that one night when we closed together and had a couple of drinks in the bar after work, I asked her a question, and the answer was, oh dear. And we don't know each other well enough. And then I may have made a suggestion or two of how we can get to know each other better. And I think I remember her asking if it was true what they said about Chico. And I said, I didn't know. And more than that, I didn't care. And what you have to remember is this was a long time ago. And for someone not to care about that sort of thing was considered suspicious back then, even with Esperanza, who despite being a good sport was just like the rest of them in most respects. Even though she would smile at me and bat her eyes and feel my muscles and ask how I kept in such good shape. So I tell her that I turned my mother's basement into a gym and I'd work out every night for at least 2 hours. And I used to play tennis professionally, and she'd smile again and bat again. And so I thought maybe it could happen with Esperanza. But the upshot was nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. Not with Esperanza in the front of the house, nor with the Royboy in the back of it. And I can remember who stopped working. If it was Esperanza, who went on to marry one of the regulars, some retired detective who come in to bother her every night around closing, and everyone liked him or at least tolerated him. But I could tell he thought he was better than all of us by the way he called people kid or sweetheart. And so I called him out on it once, and there was something of a dust up. We had to take it outside, And I was ready to drop that motherfucker with a lightning quick 1-2 combination I've been practicing on the heavy bag in my mother's basement. Right before Royboy and the others broke it up, everyone saying it wasn't worth it. And I was nothing if not cool back then. So everyone walked away, which was a shame because I would have loved dropping that motherfucker. But by then I decided this was Esperanza's problem. And if this is what she wanted, it was vaya con huevos for her. They deserve each other. And Esperanza wound up quitting 2 weeks later. And then Royboy flat out disappeared. He stopped showing up for work one day. And Jorge, his brother, would never say whatever happened to him or where he went, or even if he was dead or alive. And I tried asking a couple of times, but I didn't want it to seem like I cared that much because I didn't really. I just liked him. I liked him and I liked saying his name out loud. And he's the only Roy I've ever known. And I'm not sure if I were to meet another Roy, if I'd call that one Royboy too. I guess it would depend if that guy seemed like a Royboy, which Royboy always did, if that makes sense. And I like to think that Royboy is still around somewhere, that he's working in the back of a better house, and the people there haven't heard the rumors about him, whether they're true or not. Okay, so that is blessedly over.
That was
Okay, what do we do now?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, that was wonderful. I already said this to you earlier when we were in the digital green room, but you know, I always love hearing you read, Robert. I feel like you bring it every time, and it's great to hear you read as well because you have such an amazing sense of rhythm. And I think that really comes through when we get to listen. So I'm really glad that you read those stories. And I'm sure everyone else is too, as you can see in the chat. But I think now would be the time where I get to ask you some questions. It'll be just like going to therapy. No, so you have such a great sense of humor, Robert, and you know, oftentimes it's quite sly. So I'm thinking of an instance like in one of your stories you write, years ago, the television worked fine. I would scan the channels from 2 to 80 and back again for hours at a time. I'd spend 5 or so seconds on each station. What was on television wasn't important to me. That I was looking for something is what mattered. I was a seeker. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about these sort of subtle moments of humor and how you bring that edge of laughter to a quieter moment in the narrative.
Well, thank you I like the sound of you reading that. I much would have preferred you reading all of this instead of me. But yeah, I'm gonna be like one of the 4 or 5 funniest people in North America. And it comes across in the work. I can't keep it from not doing it. And I think it's probably a relief against the darkness that I sometimes like to move towards with the work that comes out. And if it were unrelentingly dark, I think that sort of oppression would be unbearable. And thus, something that might make us laugh in the midst of all the horror, I think makes it all go down a little bit easier. So I don't know, that's always been the way I operated in the world as a human being and as somebody who played with language.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask, in The Trouble with Paddling, there are mentions of characters, Tanya and my Sophia, both of whom appear in an earlier book of yours, Good People. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about these characters that reappear, not just across stories, but across entire books in your larger body of work. And I wonder also, now this question is getting long, it's getting to like 5 questions. But also, does that appearance suggest that you think of a better class of people and good people as, sort of twin books of sorts, or,
Indeed, in fact, there is another book, and it'll probably come out in 2024, called The Best People. And that is the culmination. And so we'll see my Sophia and Tanya, and then Esperanza, who's something of kind of this unattainable figure in a better class of people. She's almost like a ghost who you can never quite see. She has a bigger part in The Best People. She's a main character in a few of those stories. So yeah, it was fun for me to have that sort of intertextuality, and it feels like an inside joke with myself. And it's something I've done before in the novel All Back Full. The car that is featured in Part of the World makes an appearance. The guy looks out the window and it's the car that was in Part of the World. In the last piece of A Better Class of People, the narrator draws stick figures on the wall, very like the narrator of Can We Belong to a Mean River. And I suppose it's kind of up to interpretation whether or not it's the same character or if it's different people. So yeah, I like it. It amuses me. It amuses me to do that. And I figure if it amuses me, there might be 9 or 11 other people who it might amuse.
Oh, I would say that there's like 33 right here.
Yeah, so maybe there's
yeah. So you said that's up for interpretation. Do you think of the narrator of the stories in this particular book being the same narrator as in these other? Oh, see, Cowboy doesn't like the question.
Cowboy was offended by that question.
He was, because yeah, it's a hard one.
Yeah, I really like to leave it open for interpretation.
Okay, I see.
So I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might implicate me in some way.
I see. Okay, got it. Cowboy had your back. So in several of the stories in this particular book, the specter of a question hovers. And that question regards the choice of whether or not to have children. Sometimes it's speculated that women wish to have children and can't, and then hate mothers and babies for it. At another point, a character asks another why he doesn't like children if something happened, which leads to a very funny exchange in which the narrator concludes never to have been born is best. So could you talk a little bit about this preoccupation and how you see it working in this collection?
I think it probably harkens to a couple of things, conversations I've had with friends. Certainly, I remember reading a piece about a guy who was an anti-natalist, and I found him to be quite interesting. He's a South African philosophy professor, and he wrote a book about this. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I try not to examine too much what's going on in the heads of these people. I think that would probably be depressing and counterproductive for me. But yeah, I try to have, if there's something that comes up kind of organically when going through the whole book, I want to make sure that if it's an interesting enough point, if it has enough weight and gravity to it, that touching on it again at some point at a different juncture in the book, it just makes for perhaps a better reading experience where those things, those elements and that subject matter kind of occur and reoccur. And as far as specifically about that, yeah, I mean, some of my best friends are people. So I, I enjoy the people and I'm amused by the people, and I'm fine with the people for the most part. Yeah, and they're also horrifying too. So there's that as well.
Sure. So I was thinking, reading your book, about how so many of us who either teach writing or write or think about writing too much have often been told, that the way that you sort of build character is through building out their desires. And but I was reading your book, and I was thinking how very often it seems to me that your characters and their stories advance much more through impulse than desire. And I was curious if you felt that you are perhaps more interested in impulse or desire as a writer, and if so, why that too can be sort of a juicy terrain. That's a terrible metaphor. I'm going to take it back. Just pretend I didn't say juicy terrain.
Okay, there's no juicy terrain here.
Something worth exploring.
Yeah, that the impulse is really interesting to me, because it sort of implies this fleeting nature of thought. But clearly, if one has an impulse to do something, whether it's born out of something that we see or something from within, it's there. It was easily activated, or it was manifested from some desire. I don't know, I think they're related to each other in some way. Desire feels so much more heavier. It feels like you could dismiss some sort of impulse, but desire you can't so easily dismiss. And what interests me about an impulse is how one could kind of move from one impulse to the next, to the next, to the next. And that kind of flood of information that can feel important in the moment, and then is not quite as satisfying right after it. I think that's probably the greatest difference between impulse and desire, is that an impulse, if you satisfy an impulse, it might not sustain you for 5 minutes, whereas a desire hopefully will sustain you for a little bit longer than that.
Yeah.
So I like how short it is.
Yeah. Well, I always think of you, Robert, as being such a brave writer who's so much of their own voice. And as I mentioned before, you have such a great sense of rhythm. I read your stories and I just like, man, that guy really writes from his lung, and I love that quality in your work. And so, but I'm wondering, in your own writing process, if you could kind of describe what's going on in your minds. Like, are you somebody who has sort of certain aesthetic rules, whether it's about rhythm or something else, that is structuring, your composition, or, is it tapping into something that's sort of more almost outside of yourself in a way, or, or is this like a more organic process? Like, what's going on in there? I'm sorry. I feel like this is a huge question. It's terrible, but I am so curious what's happening in your mind when you're doing this.
So what happens normally is I look at it very like acting. I try to tap into something that might be from within to some extent, and perhaps in certain cases it's a larger extent, and in other cases a smaller extent. But I try to tap into something, and that voice, which it always comes down to a voice, and the voice comes from language, and that language to me is always born out of rhythm and acoustics and sound. And I want the words that are pressed up against each other to sound a very particular way, and for them to move with a sense of urgency and speed and rhythm. So yeah, the sound of it is always the most important thing to me. initially, and then I try to sculpt some kind of effect on the reader, and I hope that effect is multi-pronged. I want that effect to be laughing and feel all kinds of things at the same time. So yeah, the sound and music really are very important, and that is really the only way. I couldn't write from any other starting point. I just don't think in terms of ideas or characters. It just comes down to language and voice and music.
That's really interesting. So I'm going to ask one more question, but before I do, I just want to let everybody who's here know that we would love to take some questions from you guys. So if, while I ask my question, if you can use the Q&A function, then I will present your questions to Robert.
And it's perfectly okay if no one has any questions, and we could all get on with our evening as well.
Absolutely not okay.
I know we all have a lot of important drinking to do, and I've got the Rangers that I need to get back to, and so yeah.
Okay. So we were obviously just talking about language and rhythm and voice, and I wonder, Robert, if there was a moment for you as a writer where you felt as though you had finally kind of hit on that voice. I look at your work and I see, as I was saying, that the voice does feel so consistent to me. It feels like you are writing so much of yourself. But I know that it there must have been a time where you were sort of just beginning to write, and maybe you didn't know who you were as a writer yet. And I'm wondering if there was like a moment where you thought, oh, this is it.
Yeah, there was. It was my second year of grad school. The war just ended, and it was 1946. And no, it was the second year of grad school. Initially, I was just imitating people like Raymond Carver and Tobias Wolff and Bobby M. Mason, and it felt like a good way to learn some stuff and to cut my teeth. But then at some point in my second year of grad school, I started writing stuff that was a little bit different and not quite as under those influences. And it was a Eureka in the bathtub kind of moment when I happened upon the voice that I would lean on for the next 26 years now. Yeah.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready for my Eureka moment, by the way. So
See, that's nonsense, because I have to say,
are you telling me I need to get in the bathtub? That's my question. Just tell me if I need to get in the bathtub. Okay, so we get some questions here. Tara. So Tara wants to know, she is saying, curious to hear more about this sculpting process after you follow the voice and the choices you made in putting this book together structurally. Don't worry, I'm already drinking. I'm not worried about you, Tara.
I could tell you that we should congratulate Tara. She just accepted the offer from Arizona State University to join their MFA program.
Hey.
So that was excellent, good news. Okay, curious. I got to read the question again because I wasn't paying attention.
Okay. Oh wait, can you see it too?
Should I pretend that I can't?
Oh no, it's okay.
Okay. Curious to hear more about the sculpting process after you follow the voice and the choices you made in putting this book together structurally. Yeah, because initially when I wrote all these stories individually, I wasn't thinking about doing the book. It was just stories that happened and tumbled out of me. And then eventually I said, okay, I want to kind of do a book. All of the subway stories started on the subway. It was a little exercise I did to amuse myself. When I sat on the subway, I would just start punching some stuff into my phone of whatever I kind of saw around me. And so I had all these subway stories and I had all these longer stories, and I tried to figure out a way how to make a coherent narrative out of it that had a sense of beginning, middle, and ending, all the while playing with time. That so it doesn't really mean beginning, middle, and ending is chronological, because we do bounce around in time a little bit, and but a forward momentum was on my head, and so I would look at the stories, and when I say sculpt them, I would say, okay, introduce an element in this story that wasn't there when I first did the story, but I needed it to rhyme or echo with another story. And so there was a lot of that work after the initial composition of all the stories as they originally appeared.
Great. Tabitha would like to know what inspired, well, or maybe Aurora, I don't know. Tabitha or Aurora wants to know what inspired the title of this book.
I'll thank both Tabitha and Aurora. The title, well, I had the book Good People, and I don't quite know. Oh, I know what happened. Okay, so I had the title Good People, and that was that book that came out in 2016. And there's a line from a brilliant movie that my sister and I watched one summer like 35 times called Midnight Run, starring Robert De Niro and Charles Grodin. And Robert De Niro says to Charles Grodin, if you want to move around and talk to the people here, they were sitting in first class of an airplane. And he goes, this is a better class of people. So I always love that as a phrase, a better class of people. Like, what the hell does that mean? So I like how screwed up of a phrase. And then obviously good people, a better class of people, and then ultimately the best people will be how the saga ends.
Great. And then we have a question from Grace. Here's my question, imported over from the chat box. Your characters seem at once flagrantly confident and super insecure. I want to hear about whether or not this is a favorite personality cocktail and why.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you so much for being here. Yeah, there's something about that, because to write from the perspective of somebody who's super confident just seems tedious to me. But I like sort of bravado. The bravado of some of these characters to me is entertaining. It makes me laugh, but that they are underneath that very insecure and completely unsure of who they are or what they want or where they've been or where they're going or what it all means and who means what to them. Yeah, putting that together seems to me to make for a pretty interesting character, if not necessarily to read about, then certainly to write from that perspective. So I like the conflicting personality types jammed together in one character, the confident but yet insecure.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both so much for this really wonderful conversation. And thanks to Cowboy the dog for making an appearance. I could listen to you guys talk about this all night, but I think you're right, Robert, that everyone probably has some very important drinking to get to.
Yeah.
Those of you at home, thank you for your insightful questions. Please consider purchasing a copy of A Better Class of People from Community Bookstore. And we hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great evening. Congrats, Robert.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Tracy. And Tracy's last two books, Quotients and The Hopeful, are killer. You should get those too.
Thank you. Thanks so much for doing this. This was so fun.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Thank you, Noah.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay.